Hello folks, this is Dr. DeValley, and this lecture I call the layer cake theory of culture. If you imagine human culture as a three-layer cake sitting on a plate, where the plate is the natural environment and the three layers of the cake are key aspects of human society, you'll kind of get the image. We'll go through it a little more in a bit. Again, first, what is culture? Okay, we went over this in an earlier video, but most anthropologists define culture as the learned, socially acquired traditions of thought and behavior found in human societies. It is a socially acquired lifestyle that includes patterned, repetitive ways of thinking, feeling, and acting. Okay, in other words, the attributes are that it's learned, it's shared by you and other members of your society, and culture also generates behavior, what it considers appropriate behavior in the appropriate context, and also culture interprets experience for its members. Again, it's this socially acquired lifestyle that includes patterned behavior, repetitive ways of thinking, feeling, and acting. And it is through culture that humans adapt to the physical and social world. The purpose of human culture. The purpose of human culture is adaptation for its members. Successful adaptation, really, for any species involve survival of its present population and procreation so the population can continue through time. Now, humans have adapted both biologically and behaviorally. Walking upright, bipedalism, is an example of biological adaptation where our bodies changed literally structure to adapt to a changing environment. In this particular case, it was through the cooling of the earth and the drying up of rainforests and the development of large grasslands with tall grasses. And so an animal that could walk upright could see further, see prey ahead of time. And so that was an adaptive advantage that we happened to get biologically through blind variation and selective retention, the way all biological adaptation occurs. Blind variation is that there just happened to be a couple that produced a little kink in their genes, and it was easier for them to stand on two legs rather than on four, and their offspring survived, and so they reproduced at greater rates, and offspring that they produced were like themselves, and over time the genes of the population changed. Okay. Now, culture, on the other hand, is an example of behavioral adaptation. Now, there's a big advantage to behavioral adaptation because culture is learned. It also, if need be, can be unlearned. It's difficult to unlearn anything, as you know, but it is possible. So let's say, for an example, take the giraffe. The giraffe has evolved a long neck so it could reach the bottom of taller trees, and giraffes live in grasslands where there are few trees, and its long neck allows it to, one, see predators far away, and two, reach up to the die out, as many species have in the past. But culture is an example of where we can learn a behavior in a new situation and then unlearn it in a different situation where it no longer applies. Okay. So, for example, an immigrant may come from a country, an immigrant to the United States may come from a culture where it's okay to beat your wife. In other words, if you're angry at your wife and your wife does something wrong, it's okay to physically punish her. No problem. Now that person immigrates to the United States or to Western Europe or many other cultures where that behavior is not appropriate. In other words, it's not only not appropriate, but it's illegal to beat your wife in the United States. And if you do so, you could end up going to jail. So here a person has grown up in a culture and learned a behavior that is socially acceptable, like wife beating, but finds themselves in a different environment where wife beating is no longer socially acceptable and has the ability to de-learn that behavior. In other words, to learn not to beat your wife and instead to talk to her. That's an example of cultural adaptation through learned behavior, which is culture. That's what makes us really different from other creatures. Okay. Now, the advantages of biological or cultural versus biological adaptation are something I've mentioned some of them. Over time, humans have relied more on a cultural adaptation over biological changes. In other words, for the last million years, we have been pretty much the same physiologically. Our brains have increased and our intelligence has increased, but the rest of our bodies have remained pretty much the same. Uh, we've undergone many changes, but these have been more in terms of behavior, in terms of human culture. And again, culture is learned, and thus it has the advantage of being possible to unlearn when it's necessary. And thirdly, this is a great advantage over biological or genetic change that has allowed humans to occupy and dominate every ecosystem on Earth. We can live in the Arctic because we've learned how to make and use clothing. We can live in the desert because we've learned how to make and use shelter to keep us from the sun. And, we're learning to live on the moon and in space. And who knows, in future generations, we'll be living on Mars. In other words, it's because of culture that we can do these things. Okay, now what is the layer cake theory of culture? So again, look at the graph or the chart on the left. There is the plate of the layer cake, okay, the blue bar. Now that includes the natural and social environment of a society. The natural environment is where they live. It's the actual physical ecosystem. And the social environment are the neighboring cultures that are around them. For example, you cannot grow bananas on Long Island because Long Island doesn't have the proper climate for growing bananas. So we could make hothouses, but we could not produce them as economically efficient as they could, say, in Central America. So the natural environment provides a structure that the human culture has to learn to adapt to. And so is the social environment. For example, bordering the United States to the north is Canada. Uh, if you look at Canada, most of their cities and most of the population are very close to the North American border because there's a great deal of economic interdependence. Uh, uh, the American economic system is much greater, much more powerful, and so it is an advantage for Canadians to be able to be friendly and interact with the American economic system. We also share similar cultural heritages. In other words, our original populations were both from England for the most part. So that's the social part of the environment that every society, every culture has to adjust to. Now let's look at the three layers of the cake. The bottom layer is sometimes called the techno-economic base. This is the part of culture where humans make a living and survive. Okay? It includes what are called the energetic and economic relations the society has. In other words, how energy is harnessed, processed, and distributed to members of the society. In other words, Harnessing energy, we have to, for example, for heat, we live in a climate that needs heat in certain times of the year. So one of the energy sources we use is oil. So we have to know how to harness oil, how to process it so we can use it, and how to distribute it to members of the culture who do not directly harness oil. So this is the techno-economic base that every culture has. Simple hunter-gatherer bands, the techno-economic base is rather simple. Complex cultures like ours, it's very complex. Now the second layer of the cake is the social structure. This is the part of culture where humans are organized and taught how to function in the lower part, in the base. How to work together, how to get along. Now, the social structure includes customs and institutions by which people in the society are organized. For example, family structure, kinship groups, sodalities, which are like membership in groups that for a common purpose, institutions, child training practices, institutions, for example, like schools, okay, child training practices. These are the ways individuals are raised, enculturated, and taught what are the culturally acceptable rules of behavior and ways of thinking, stuff like that. Now, the third layer of the cake, the top layer, is referred to as the ideology of a culture. Sometimes these three layers, the techno-economic layer is maybe called the base, the social structure is called a structure, and the ideology is called the superstructure. But whatever you want to call them, cultures have these three areas. Now, in the ideology layer of the cake, that includes the belief systems, religion, values, modal personality, etc. This is the part of culture where the person gets the values, attitudes, and personality traits that allow for functioning in the society. In other words, that allow a person to fit in well, more or less, in the culture they live in. For example, the Yanomami people that live in southern Brazil and northern Brazil and southern Venezuela are a tribal group that mainly grow plantains and are in a state of constant warfare with their other neighboring Yanomami villages. So an ideal Yanomami man is one who fights at the drop of a hat, carries his weapons, is aggressive, is not afraid of danger, and that's the way he settles problems is by picking up an axe. Okay. Now, if a Yanomami man was transferred to our society, he would end up in jail or on Rikers Island pretty quickly, because that kind of behavior is considered dysfunctional. It's not socially tolerated in our culture. So it's in the ideology section. For example, Yanomamo males are raised to be aggressive. In other words, when they hit their parents or yell at their parents or strike their parents with a stick, they're praised. In other words, that's considered good behavior. Where in our culture, if a child was to do that, a boy was to hit his mother or his father, that would be considered very poor behavior and the child would be punished. And gradually would be learned that he would learn that he would have to control his emotional feelings, his emotional outburst. He could not vent his aggression at will. That is what the ideological sphere of a culture does. It prepares the person to fit in to the society. The social structure helps organize the person so they could work with the bottom techno-economic base is through which the culture survives. Now, a society exists in place and time. Its environment contains physical possibilities and limits. Like I said, you can't grow bananas in New York. Okay. Now, the interaction is also dynamic. I show these arrows here, but they're not only going one way. The ideology influences social structure, influences techno-economic base, and vice versa. So this process works both ways. It's a dynamic one. The three women, as a young woman doing field work